Airgun technology is advancing faster than we can keep up with it. We are on the brink of breaking down the door of rimfire performance, but with the power limitations of what we can physically achieve with compressed air, there is only one thing standing in the way of complete domination: projectile design. In this episode, we are going to test the ballistic performance of 3 .22 caliber bowtail slugs, not just for precision, but for ballistic coefficient, and along the way, I'm going to show you how to correctly measure the BC of your projectiles and explain where so many people get it wrong. Hold on to your seats, we're going in deep.
In the world of shooting, technology is always progressing forward. And normally this is a slow sort of progression towards better accuracy, better performance. But every now and again, something happens that is more like a giant leap forward. And we've seen that over the years. When barrel rifling was developed, which helped to shoot longer, sleeker bullets further, faster, more accurately, that was a big jump. Smokeless powder was a big thing. The bolt action rifle was a big deal. And rangefinders are a big deal. Being able to accurately know how far you're shooting so that you can actually account for it. And we've seen the same in the airgun world. We've seen the introduction of pressure regulators, which allow for more consistent velocities. And then a few years ago, we saw kind of the big leap from pellets to slugs as we, were able to get hold of mass-produced, high-quality, small bore air rifle slugs and actually develop barrels around them to shoot very precisely. That kind of left pellets in the dust as we saw our ballistic coefficients, double, triple, quadruple in just the space of a couple of years. And we're on the brink of another big leap forward. This year, I went to Rocky Mountain Airgun Challenge with a rifle that won last year fairly convincingly, thinking that, I'm going to just stick with the winning formula. I was mentally very, very sharp this year. I didn't make any mental errors. I kind of cruised through the course of fire, but I was left in the dust by the 9 shooters who finished in front of me. I finished in 10th place. The 9 shooters in front of me who were all shooting boat-tail slugs. I've always said that ballistic coefficient is king. I didn't follow that this year, and I paid the price for it, not being able to account for the wind as well as the guys who were shooting these high BC boat-tail slugs. So, a leap forward has happened this year. Suddenly we went from having no boat-tail slugs in the top 10, 20, I don't know, last year, to this year having 9 of the top 10 shooting boat-tail slugs. So we need to start exploring this. And we're going to do that today with the help of 3 air guns. We've got an FX Impact M4, which is going to shoot a 40 grain slug about 1,000 feet per second, maybe 1,015 feet per second. We've got a FX Pantera, which I think will shoot at a very similar velocity. And we've got the DRS Pro, which will probably shoot a 40 grain about 960. The Pantera and the DRS both have 1 in 16 twist barrels. That's a standard slug liner. The Impact has an 800 millimeter 1 in 14 twist barrel, which I'm very curious to see, if that actually shoots the boat tails better. And if it does, we can give the feedback to FX, and maybe that's something they can, work towards to focus on getting those boat tails really shooting well. But the main point of this video is actually to address a big misconception around ballistic coefficient and what ballistic coefficient actually is. So before we jump into the shooting and we start analyzing these slugs, let's have a bit of a lesson. So here's what you need to know about ballistic coefficient, or BC. The BC is just a reference number that quantifies how much drag a projectile is going to experience as it travels through the air, but it's only one factor in determining how a slug will decelerate, and this is where everyone seems to get it wrong. When working out the drag induced on a projectile, there are 2 major components. The bullet itself, which is assigned a BC based on a number of factors like its sectional density and its shape, which do not change. And then of course, there's the air that it's flying through, which changes constantly depending on the pressure, temperature, and humidity. I've heard so many people say lately, wow, my BC is so much higher in Utah where the altitude's higher, or my BC drops so much when it's cold. No, it doesn't. Your BC stays the same. It's the conditions around you that are changing. And if you don't factor in the conditions, when you measure your BC, then you're going to get a value that is falsely high or falsely low. And I'll show you examples of this a bit later in the video. For the sake of my testing today, I'm going to be shooting with 3 different air guns with 3 different power settings and 3 different barrels. And you'll see some BC variation from barrel to barrel, but that is not a factor of the conditions. Rather, that's a factor of bullet stability. For a bullet to achieve its full aerodynamic potential, it needs to be traveling straight on into the oncoming airflow. But realistically, this doesn't always happen. As a bullet leaves the muzzle, it's suddenly exposed to so many forces that want to overturn it and destabilize it. And boat tails in particular are very prone to experiencing a yaw. That is when the nose is not actually flying straight into the oncoming air. This of course means that the airflow over the slug is not optimized, and that is why you sometimes see the BC value drop a few percentage points. Flat-based slugs tend to handle this better because they have a big low pressure zone at the back, which essentially pulls the center of pressure backwards and straightens them out. And that's why it's so difficult to make a good boat tail design. So let's meet our candidates for today's test. Firstly, a slug that you might be familiar with, the Zan ELR. This is a swage slug made with a fairly hard lead alloy, and it comes in at 42.3 grains. Next, the Alteros ATP King. Thanks Tom for donating these for the test. They're not cheap, and these are unique because they aren't actually swaged. They turned on a lathe, and what that allows is for some really unique design features. If you look very carefully, you can see 2 drive bands which help to engage the grooves better and seal properly. These come in at 40.5 grains. And lastly, another swage slug weighing 40 grains on the dot, which as far as I know is not available yet, so we're just going to call it Slug X for now. Similar design to the ATP King, but if we push them through a barrel, we can see where they start to differ. The Zan has the longest bearing surface. The ATP King clearly shows where the drive bands make contact, and then Slug X seems to have a slight taper to the shank, which is quite interesting. We're going to be shooting these over the FX True Ballistic chronograph to gather some data, and I'll show you exactly how to set this up properly to get the correct BC data. But first, let's get these guns out. Let's get a reliable 50 meter zero, and then we'll do all our BC testing at 100. So the first thing we're going to do, and this is critically important before we even start shooting, is we need to capture the current weather details at the location that you're measuring the ballistic coefficient. So I've got my Kestrel here. The Kestrel can tell me exactly what the current temperature is. It's 19 degrees Celsius. Station pressure 29.52 inches of mercury. Relative humidity 91%, and the rest of it is not important. But those 3 numbers are critically important. So I'm actually going to take a photo of that, and then when we start our shot string down here on the FX True Ballistics or FX radar app that connects to the True Ballistic chronograph, we're going to go into the BC tool, and we're going to make sure that the weather that it collects from the internet is actually the same weather that the Kestrel is telling me. If I had my weather saved to this location at sea level, but I was up in Utah where the station pressure was more like 25 inches of mercury instead of 29, then it would give me a highly inflated ballistic coefficient. That's what we're trying to avoid. So this is critically important. Okay, I'm going to start with the DRS Pro. First things first, we're going to do a bit of a control test. We've got the normal 36 grain flat base solid slugs that I used at RMAC, which I've been shooting for the past few years in the DRS Pro. We're going to shoot a group, but we're also going to measure with the True Ballistics chronograph. Now, I've made sure the chronograph is lined up. I've also set the distances from at the muzzle 25, 50, 75 and 100 yards. So we've got a variety of distances that we can work with later when working out our BC on the computer. But for now, let's take a group at 100 meters. I'm going to go 2.5 mils, which should be pretty close. And let's see how we do on the BC front and precision front, and that'll be a good baseline to compare against. So already it's telling me that my BC is 0.148, which seems too high for this slug. I groups. I think it's more like 0.135. So I'm going to go to BC Tool, and I'm going to check that my weather and temperature and everything is correct. And I can already see temperature, the pressure is incorrect. So we're going to manually correct that. I see they've updated the app now, so you can manually correct it, which is great. The air pressure was definitely not correct. It's supposed to be 29.52. 139. Okay, that's very, very close to what I had before. I had 135 G1 on the Kestrel that I was using for RMAC. So 135, 139, that's pretty close, and that looks a lot more consistent to me.
So first up we have Slug X, and I have no idea what to expect here. This is the first time I've ever shot a group with these slugs, aside from the 5 fouling shots just prior to shooting this group. And talk about starting with a bang.
Dang. That might be one of the best groups I've ever shot out of this gun. That's insane.
Next up, the ATP Kings. Note that neither the ATP Kings or the Zan ELRs fit into the DRS magazine, so that's just something that you'll need to keep in mind. The lid did close on the ATPs, but once the mag was inserted they didn't cycle reliably, so I had to remove the mag between each shot and give it a shake.
And really not a bad group, but sheesh, it's not as good as that first one.
The Zan ELRs are way too long, we'll have to single load them.
Okay, not terrible, but not great either, and can't fit the magazine, not going to be shooting it. Two things that are great about the Pantera. Firstly, larger air capacity, so I don't have to refill with air as often. Secondly, deeper magazine, so it will cycle all of these slugs, which means no single loading, which is great news.
I didn't record the groups on paper for the rest of these guns, so we'll just condense all the shooting footage into a short montage and get straight to the results, which is what we're really here for.
That is what I call victory. Ignore this is just sighted targets and foul seasoning in the barrel and all of that before the actual groups. But that's 5 shots with the what we'll call Slug X, 5 shots with the ATP Kings, and then 5 shots with the Zan ELRs. And all of those are literally fingernail groups. I think there's something in this 1 in 14 twist barrel. I think a little bit more testing with the faster twist is going to be a good thing. And we saw it with the BCs as well. Very high BCs, and especially this first slug, the swaged Slug X, 0.21. So only one of these that consistently got above 0.2. That's competition winning stuff, and it makes sense. I mean, I think 8 of the top 10 shooters were shooting these slugs at RMAC, and yeah, big difference. Cool, let's go home and assess the numbers, and we'll see if we can learn some stuff. So now that we have all our data, let's take some time to analyze what we're actually seeing. And before we jump straight into the chronograph numbers, I think we should take a look at the groups. Now, I wouldn't take this as gospel truth of what's the most accurate slug. The reality is I've only taken a 5-shot group with each slug out of each barrel. That's a very small sample size. I think you'd need a lot more than that to get very, very clear answers. And also there's been no tuning involved whatsoever. So it's possible that by changing some valve settings, etc., we can actually tighten these groups up even further. But what I'm most interested in is to see if there's any correlation between what we're seeing on paper and what we're seeing on the chronograph numbers. It seemed to me like different barrels preferred different slugs, but overall I'm super impressed. All 3 of these slugs shot average groups under 1 MOA. That's amazing without any tuning, with the ATP King just edging out Slug X and the Zan ELR not far behind. Special mention must go to the Impact, which shot an average group size of 0.59 MOA across 3 different brands of slugs. And remember, the Impact had the 1 in 14 twist barrel, so I definitely think there's something there worth exploring.
I'd love to get hold of a 1 in 14 and maybe even a 1 in 12 twist in 700 millimeter and actually test them in the DRS Pro and the Pantera to see if there's any improvements there also. Now for the numbers, and what you're seeing here might look quite complicated, but it's actually just taking something simple and breaking it down a little bit more. What I like to do is to actually go into the data for every single shot and make a spreadsheet with the velocities at different distances. So the true ballistic chronograph measures the velocity all the way out to 100 yards. I can actually take the velocity values at, let's say, at the muzzle, 25, 50, 75, and 100, get those velocities on a graph, and then check what's the average velocity from that 5-shot string, and then what's the deviation of those 5 velocities at different ranges. That can teach us a lot also, and that can allow us to measure a BC at those different distances, so we can actually see how consistent the BC is over those ranges also, and work out a more precise average. These columns here, the BC G1 drag function, that's the average BC at different distances, and the BC RF4 drag function, these are really important because that's our BC deviation. BC deviation is really important because it tells us whether the slug is actually flying the same way every time. There's no point having a very tight velocity spread at the muzzle if the velocity then deviates downrange and you end up with a massive velocity spread at long distance. You actually want that tight velocity deviation to remain the same at distance, and the only way that can happen is if your BC remains consistent from shot to shot and at different distances. It's also very helpful to see both the G1 and RF4 BCs at the same time, because this can help us to decide what drag function better suits that particular projectile. So for example, if we look at Slug X out the Pantera, and we look at the 2 rows here of BCs, we can see that the G1 drag function, the numbers are very, very consistent, while the RF4 drag function, the numbers seem to climb as we lose velocity. And what that's basically telling us is that that projectile tracked closer to what a standard G1 drag curve looks like than an RF4 drag curve. And if you use a G1 BC in your ballistic calculator, you're probably going to get more precise results from the ballistic calculator because it's tracking the G1 drag curve instead of the RF4 drag curve when it's trying to predict what your projectile is going to do. I suppose I should also explain how I'm actually calculating these BCs, because the true ballistic chronograph, it gives you an accurate BC provided you put in the right atmospheric data, but it only gives you a single BC. What we're doing here is we're trying to break it down further to give a BC every 25 meters so we can see how consistent that BC is across the entire range. So what we do is we take this information, we go to a website called JBM Ballistics. They've got a ballistic calculator on the website. First thing you do is you enter chronograph separation, so that's every 25 yards. And then we can put our near velocity, our far velocity, drag function we want to measure, and then all our atmospheric data. And I've just copied the atmospheric data straight from what I measured on the morning of testing. And this is critically important. Hit calculate, and then it spits out there you go, ballistic coefficient G1 BC of 0.193, and that's the value that I plug into the table. Now, let me just show you what would have happened if I came from Utah and I didn't update the software that's measuring my BC to these conditions, and I tried to calculate my BC based on the conditions that I measured in Utah. So in Utah, the temperature would probably be 30 degrees, humidity probably 30% right now, and pressure probably 25.5 inches of mercury. So my velocity data has not changed. But if I now hit calculate, the BC is now 0.158, so significantly lower. And I would come here thinking, oh, my BC's dropped so much here in along the coast where, you know, the air is thicker. Your BC hasn't dropped, you've just put in the wrong data. So that's critically important. Now that we've ironed out that,
let's move on. Of course, the best thing to do would be to have a custom drag model specifically for your projectile shape, but the reality is we don't have that for every projectile, and especially for these new airgun slugs, they just don't exist. So what we have to do is to select a drag model, let's say G1 for example, and then we need to get a BC number for that drag model. And I suppose we should explain what a ballistic coefficient actually is then. So a BC is basically a reference to a drag curve. And each drag curve depicts how a particular projectile shape behaves at different velocities. So a projectile with, let's say, an elliptical nose is going to behave coming through transonic and subsonic speeds very differently to a long VLD projectile with a very long, sharp, pointy secant or tangent ogive. And that's why we have to have different, what we call standard projectiles. So a G7 drag curve is based on a G7 standard projectile, which is a sleek VLD boat tail bullet, more typically shot out of centerfire rifles. Not what we want for this application. A G1 is a flat base bullet with a tangent ogive, more like a more traditional vomiting bullet. And RF4 is the drag function for a rimfire bullet, which typically has a rounded or elliptical nose and a flat base. I found that RF4 and G1 both tend to work quite well with airgun projectiles, but these boat tails we're testing today don't really fit the mold of any of these, and that's why we're testing them. Starting with the DRS Pro data, what really stood out to me here was the velocity spreads downrange. They were incredibly consistent for both the ATP King and the Zan ELR. So we had extreme spread of 4 feet per second at the muzzle in the ATP King, but at 100 yards, the velocity spread was still 4 feet per second. That is telling us that our BC consistency is incredibly precise from slug to slug, and it means they're probably flying exactly the same every time you shoot them. Same with the Zan ELR, started at 8, ended at 8. The Javelin and Slug X, so the Javelin was basically our baseline test to see what sort of BC we would get, and it basically tracked 135 exactly as I expected. The Javelin and Slug X, you could see the velocities climbed a bit, but I'm not too concerned about that. Those numbers are still very good. At 100, it's under 10 feet per second, not too concerned. Funnily enough though, this had zero influence at all on group sizes, and there was no correlation between velocity spreads and the size of the group. Slug X still smoked the others out of the DRS Pro. Another observation is that if I compare the flat base 36 grain slug to the 40 grain boat tail, at the muzzle there's like a 33 feet per second difference here. But look at 100 yards. The heavier 40 grain boat tail has actually overtaken the velocity of the flat base slug. That's pretty crazy, and it shows just why ballistic coefficient is so important. I mean, at long range, we're talking 200, 300 yards, the boat tail is going to drastically outcompete the flat base slug just on retained velocity and the ability to buck the wind. Next up, the Pantera, and this gun gave us the worst groups out of the lot. I shouldn't complain because the average group size was still under 1 MOA, which is great for a new slug that we haven't tested before, and 3 different slugs without tuning, so can't complain about that. The BCs were also slightly lower on average. However, this gun hasn't been shot in a year and a half, so it's possible that the barrel just needed to be cleaned. Maybe there was bits of lead in there that were, damaging the slugs as they flew out. I don't know, but I'm really not concerned looking at those group sizes. They're really not bad. The impact was the surprise package here. It absolutely dominated. Every single one of these groups was sub-MOA, easily sub-MOA, straight out the blocks. And the reason that I was surprised is because this is the hardest gun out of all of them to shoot well. It hasn't got that long design with lots of weight that you can shoot off a bag and bipod easily.
It's very bouncy when you shoot off a bar pod because the bar pod's so close to you and the legs are at an angle. So it took a lot more effort to actually shoot it well, and it still outshot the others. So that's telling us something. And it really seemed to gel well with Slug X. The BCs that we got out of this barrel with Slug X are just insanely high, which tells us that it was very, very stable and flying very, very straight and probably reaching its full potential. This could be the faster twist rate, creating better stability, but it could also be other factors. With a longer barrel, there's less back pressure behind the slug as it leaves the muzzle, so there's less air trying to overthrow the stability of the slug. It could be the way that it's tuned, but the barrels were also made years apart, so the land groove dimensions between these three barrels are all a little bit different, and they've got slightly different designs to them. So the tightness of of the lands and grooves around the slug might also be different, and it could be that we've just found a sweet spot here. So we definitely need to do some more investigations with faster twist rates, but make them all off the same sort of batch so that we can compare the twist rates themselves and just isolate that in one particular rifle, for example. Lastly, let's look at a summary of all the numbers to see if we can identify any patterns. If we look at the BC numbers first, Slug X won the battle with the highest BC, which is interesting because it was actually the lightest slug, so it had the lowest sectional density. The Zan ELR came in second, which once again would make sense. It's got the highest weight, so highest sectional density. It should perform well. And then the ATP King was in last place. But I want to mention how consistent the ATP King's BC measurements were. If you look at this column here, that's within 0.001 across three different barrels. That's incredibly consistent, and I can only guess that this has something to do with the drive band design. Those two drive bands probably allow for more forgiving engagement with the rifling, and so as the dimensions of the barrel change across different barrel designs and different twist rates and different chokes and all that stuff, it's probably just more adaptable, and that's where the consistency is coming from. And if we look at group sizes, perhaps there is a correlation we can make here between the BC consistency and the group sizes, because the ATP King actually just edged out Slug X. Slug X had the smallest group, but it also had one of the biggest groups. So consistency does matter, and it just goes to show, like, you need to test different slugs in your barrel. You might have this barrel where the Slug X shot sub half MOA group, and it might be by far the best option, but averages do matter if you, let's say, want to use the same slug in multiple guns, and the ATP King came in with the smallest average group size, thanks to possibly that consistency with having those drive bands and being able to adapt better to different barrels. And lastly, talking about correlations, there was no correlation between velocity spreads and group sizes, nothing at all. And I think there's something to be learned there. With centerfire rifles and rimfires, we chasing those very, very, very tight extreme spreads, very tight velocity spreads. And the reason is that, at long range, that starts to string out vertically and your group size will grow vertically. However, what the large velocity spreads we're talking about here are still considered excellent by any match grade rimfire and ammunition combo. They're actually still very good, even though as an air gunner we say, that's not a great extreme spread. It's still sub 10 feet per second. It's still very good. So what I'm going to take from this is that I'm going to trust that the gun will handle the velocity spread thing. We're using, these slugs are all very, very consistent weight-wise, so we're not going to have as big of a spread as you're going to see with pellets. So velocity spread for me is a lot less of a consideration, and ballistic coefficient consistency, and group size are the three things that I'm really going to focus on moving forward when I'm choosing which slug to use out of my guns. And hey, that's where we're going to end this video. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing. It's been a while since I've done a nerdy technical video like this, but I really do enjoy sometimes taking a deep dive and looking at numbers and trying to get the best out of my equipment, as opposed to the normal videos of me just going out and smoking a bunch of monkeys with the centerfires and air rifles. So please do consider subscribing if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.